In a dusty Texas sunrise, beneath the rusted tin roof of a U.S. internment camp for Japanese women prisoners of war, a ragged hound sat unmoving beside a young nurse's cot. She had collapsed from fever 2 nights earlier. Her pulse had steadied, but her spirit had not. The other women watched from their bunks as the mutt refused to move, guarding her like a sentinel made of fur and dust. When a cowboy-hatted guard tried to coax him away with beef jerky, he simply growled and placed a paw across the nurse's blanket. "He won't leave her side," the cowboy said. What the hound did next stunned everyone. When the nurse stirred and cried out in her sleep, the dog howled, low and sorrowful, as if grieving her pain. Then he did something no one expected. He climbed onto the bed and laid his body beside hers, warming her with his own. The prisoners gasped. One wept. They had seen loyalty in battle. But never like this. The morning after his silent vigil, the camp woke to a wind that carried dust across the yard like a second skin. It crept under doors, through floorboards, and into lungs already tired from weeks of choking on defeat. The women stirred slowly, their bodies still learning how to trust a day that did not begin with shouting or rifle butts. Outside, guards walked their routine paths between watchtowers, boots pressing shallow prints into the pale earth. And there, curled near the entrance of the infirmary tent, the dog remained. He had not wandered off in the night. He had not gone searching for scraps or shade. He had stayed. Dust clung to his coat, his ribs still visible beneath matted fur, yet his posture held a strange calm, like a sentry who had chosen his post with quiet certainty. No one knew where he had come from. He appeared just after a supply truck rolled through the gates 2 evenings earlier, its tires trailing red dirt, and its bed stacked with crates. Some said he had followed the convoy from miles away. Others whispered he had belonged to a ranch nearby, abandoned or lost when the war twisted even the lives of animals. The guards claimed he had wandered out of the brush, drawn by the smell of stew and bread. But the women noticed something else. He had paused at the fence, nose lifted, eyes searching, as if weighing a decision no one had asked him to make. And then he had slipped through a gap in the wire, squeezing his lean body through with a patience that felt more intentional than desperate. At first, laughter followed him. One of the younger prisoners whispered that perhaps he was another form of mockery from fate, an American dog free to walk where they could not. A guard tipped his hat and called him a camp ornament, his tone half amused, half puzzled. Yet the dog did not roam like an ornament. He did not dart between boots or beg near the kitchen. Instead, he walked slowly down the narrow aisle of the barracks, nose low, ears alert, as if listening to something buried beneath the floorboards. He stopped only once, beside the nurse's bunk, where she lay wrapped in a thin blanket, her face pale, her eyelids trembling with restless sleep. She had arrived 2 days earlier, carried in by other women, when her legs refused to hold her any longer. Hunger and fever had hollowed her, sharpening her cheekbones and dulling her eyes. The camp medic had said little, only that she needed rest, fluids, patience. But even as they tucked her into the narrow bed, the other prisoners sensed the weight she carried. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was little more than air. She moved as if each step were borrowed, each breath a task. No one knew her full story, only that she had been a nurse once, trained to bind wounds and swallow fear for the sake of others. Now she barely had the strength to raise her own hand. The dog noticed anyway. When she woke that morning, her throat dry, the tent thick with the scent of antiseptic, and tin cups of lukewarm coffee, she found him there. His eyes were softer up close, clouded with dust and something like recognition. She did not reach for him. She merely watched, In her world before capture, dogs had been used sparingly, often as guards or messengers, tools more than companions. Yet this one did not carry the sharp attention of a trained animal. He carried stillness, and it unsettled her more than noise ever could. Later, when the lunch trays arrived, thin soup, a piece of bread and a spoonful of beans. She hesitated, as always. Hunger had long since turned into something quiet and coiled inside her, a thing that listened rather than demanded. But the smell, faint and metallic, lifted memories anyway. Her hand trembled as she tore a corner from her bread. She did not know why she did it. There was no plan, no reason. She simply lowered her arm and let the piece fall near the edge of her bunk. The dog did not lunge. He watched her face first, as if waiting for permission that was never spoken. Only then did he lean forward, take the bread with care, and retreat a small distance away before eating. No growl, no snatching, just gratitude wrapped in dust. That was how it began. Not with a command, not with training, but with a gesture so small it was almost invisible. A crust of bread exchanged between two beings who had lost nearly everything. The guards noticed later that day. They had seen dogs before, strays drifting near camps for scraps, lingering for a handout before moving on. But this one remained anchored to the infirmary area. When another prisoner cried out during a coughing fit, he stood. When the nurse shifted in her sleep, he lifted his head. When a medic approached with a tray of bandages, the dog stepped aside, but did not leave. This persistence drew quiet amusement at first. One guard, a broad-shouldered Texan with a creased hat and sunburned hands, laughed under his breath. "Look at him," he said to another. "Fella's found religion, like a four-legged chaplain." The nickname stayed. Chaplain. The women listened when they heard it. Chaplain. A word they barely understood in full, but one that carried a strange weight. A spiritual guide, a comforter in wartime. And somehow the name fit him more than any collar could. By evening he had walked among 3 different cots, sniffing the air, pausing near the sickest, settling only when he felt a heartbeat weaken or strengthen beneath his presence. He did not bark, he did not beg. He only observed, as if his purpose had nothing to do with food and everything to do with endurance. And the nurse, still too weak to stand, finally reached down and let her fingers brush his fur. For a moment so brief it almost vanished. Her eyes softened. In that touch the camp felt less like a cage and more like a threshold, and the idea that she had been chosen, not ordered, began to shift something silent inside her. For days, silence had clung to her the way damp cloth clung to skin after rain. It was not the silence of sleep or exhaustion. It was deliberate, a quiet wall she had built long before the fever took hold, back when her unit still marched beneath a flag that promised glory but delivered only ash. The other women noticed it. In the beginning, some had mistaken it for arrogance, others for shock. But as time stretched forward and no words came, they understood it was something heavier, a refusal, or perhaps a shielding. In her world before captivity, words had carried weight only when they served obedience. Anything unnecessary was trimmed away like excess thread. She had grown up with Bushido shaping every breath she took, even before she could name the word. As a child, her father had bowed deeper at the shrine each morning, his spine straight as iron, whispering prayers for loyalty and endurance. In school, they were taught that the emperor's will flowed like blood through their veins, that surrender was not merely defeat, but disgrace so total it stained generations. By the time she trained as a nurse with the imperial forces, the message had carved itself into bone. If captured, she was to die. If injured, she was to endure. If ordered, she was to obey. Compassion was permitted only in service of victory, never toward herself. And yet she had not died. She had endured, and obedience had led her into a net she had been trained never to accept. Sometimes, when night crept over the camp and the lights dimmed to a mild glow along the fences, the past seeped through her closed eyes. The jungle came first, thick, breathing, alive with insects and rot. The heat had wrapped around her like a second uniform, soaked through with sweat and blood that never truly dried. She could still feel the earth sucking at her boots as she followed wounded men back to improvised stations between trees splintered by artillery. She remembered the way flies gathered on open wounds, black and persistent, the way every bandage ran out too quickly, the way orders came faster than supplies and mercy was rationed more tightly than food. The final days had not felt like days at all. They had been a continuous blur of smoke, screams, and whispered prayers. She remembered the officer who had stood before them, sword resting at his side, telling them surrender was unthinkable. His eyes had not wavered even when artillery cracked the ground behind him. She remembered the medics who swallowed pills before capture could reach them, their bodies collapsing with grim resolve. And she remembered the forest path where she had been separated from her unit, the air thick with gunfire, her hands stained with other people's blood. When American soldiers finally approached, she had been too weak to lift her arms. Even then, she had expected a rifle butt, a shouted insult, the final humiliation her training had promised. Instead, she had been given water. That memory burned more fiercely than the violence ever could. Within the camp, her silence became a presence all its own. It lingered between the bunks, hovered near the infirmary tent, unsettled the air like a question no one dared speak aloud. Some women avoided her, as though her quiet carried contagion. Others watched her with a tenderness they did not yet allow themselves, and all of them noticed the Hound. He had become a fixture now. Not a wandering stray, but something rooted. When the nurse closed her eyes, he lay beside the cot. When a guard approached with medicine, he lifted his head but did not growl. When another prisoner cried softly in the corner, he did not move until the sound weakened. It was as though he knew only one duty: to remain. Even the guards began watching with new attention. At first they had found it amusing, a harmless distraction in a routine defined by paperwork and ration lines, but when they saw the dog refuse food offered by the kitchen until the nurse had eaten, when they noticed how he shifted closer whenever her breathing grew shallow, their expressions changed. Not softer, more alert, as though they too were witnessing something that unsettled their training. One afternoon, a guard with a slow southern drawl paused beside her cot and spoke more gently than usual. He asked if she could understand him. She did not answer. She did not look at him. The dog did. His eyes never left the man's face, measuring, steady, unafraid. The guard exhaled, tipped his hat slightly, and stepped back. From that day forward, her treatment shifted almost imperceptibly. Warm water came more often. Blankets were replaced before they thinned. Interruptions were fewer. And still, she remained silent. But inside, the dog's presence had begun to loosen something that had been clenched for too long. Not trust, not forgiveness. Something smaller. Recognition. Each time his body pressed lightly against the side of her bed, warm and breathing, she felt life asserting itself without ideology, without orders. He did not demand loyalty. He did not care who had won or lost. He simply stayed. And in a world where she had been trained that staying alive was dishonor, that simple devotion unsettled her more than gunfire ever had. The camp no longer felt like a place of pure captivity. It felt like a stage where something unplanned had taken root. A story had begun, not of nations or flags, but of a creature who refused to leave, and a woman who no longer knew how to speak, but was beginning, slowly, to listen. They had lived so long in silence that when the guards brought out paper and pencils, it felt like a trick. The announcement was simple, almost absurdly casual. The women were permitted to write letters home. The words fell into the air like a pebble into a still pond, small, unassuming, and yet sending out ripples that unsettled every surface. At first, no one moved. Some thought it was a test. Others assumed it was propaganda, a staged gesture to manipulate them. After all, what nation would let the enemy speak freely to the families they had supposedly betrayed by surviving? The young nurse sat against the infirmary tent wall, her eyes still dull with recovery, when a folded sheet was placed in her hand. No explanation, no pressure, just the faint scent of pencil lead and thin paper. The dog lay across her feet, head resting on one paw, the slow rise and fall of his breath the only sign of motion. She stared at the page as if it were a wound, blank, white, waiting. Across the camp, murmurs rose like dust. Some women clutched their letters like fragile bones, afraid the wind might carry them away. Others shook their heads, refusing to write. What was there to say? How could you send comfort to a mother you'd shamed by surrender? How could you reach across an ocean with a sentence that might as well be betrayal? But still, a line formed. For the nurse, the silence around the letter was heavier than the fever had ever been. Her fingers trembled as she held the pencil. Her hands, once so steady dressing jungle wounds, shook now with a force she did not understand. She had been trained to serve, not to speak, to stitch, not to explain. What could she write? That she had not died? That she was eating meals under a flag she once called monstrous? That a dog sat by her side as if she were worth guarding? The words, when they came, were stilted, like trying to walk on unfamiliar ground. She wrote slowly, carefully, erasing and starting again. "Mother, I am alive." The pencil paused. That alone felt like a betrayal. She had imagined her mother lighting incense at a home shrine, believing her daughter had died with honor, that she had died quickly, quietly, usefully. Not this, lingering in captivity, breathing borrowed air. She continued anyway. "I am alive. I was not beaten. I was not shamed. I was helped." Her stomach twisted. The word felt wrong. Helped by the enemy? It was like writing lies, except she knew it was true. They had given her medicine. They had fed her broth when she could not lift a spoon. They had let her rest. And through it all, the dog had stayed. Chaplain, as the guards called him, had not moved from her side the entire time she wrote. At moments he would shift his head, glancing up at her like he was reading each word as it formed. When her hand stopped, he would nudge her ankle gently, as if urging her onward. The connection was quiet, almost sacred. He did not understand nations, nor shame, but he understood the rhythm of breath, the tremble of hands, the weight of words unsaid. When she finally finished, the nurse folded the letter once, neatly. She had written only a few lines. "I am alive. I do not understand this place. I was told they would hate me, but I am being treated like a human." She could not bring herself to write more. What would her mother think? What would the men in Tokyo say when they intercepted it, as surely they would? Would they call her broken? Perhaps she was. But if so, then the break had let something in. Light, warmth, a loyalty that came not from flag or blood, but from a dusty creature who had chosen her without demand. She handed the letter to the guard. He did not read it. He simply nodded, tucked it into a canvas pouch, and walked away. She watched him go, her chest hollow and full all at once. At her feet, the hound shifted. She reached down, brushed his ear lightly, and for the first time since capture, whispered aloud, "Thank you." The dog didn't move, but his tail thumped once, soft against the floorboards, as if he'd been waiting for her voice all along. The rain came suddenly, hammering the tin roof like fists from the sky. It was the kind of Texas storm that didn't ask permission. Thunder cracked over the barracks like artillery, rattling spoons in mess kits and sending thin streams of water down the dusty walkways. The air, heavy and swollen with heat just hours before, turned sharp with ozone and earth. From the infirmary tent, the scent of boiled rice mingled with the wet metallic tang of the storm, oddly comforting, oddly foreign. For the prisoners, the downpour was a strange kind of blessing. Rain back home had often meant cover for air raids or a lull in fighting. Here it meant something else, renewal, stillness. But for one woman, it marked the unraveling. The nurse had not eaten that morning. She had stared at the bowl of rice, steam curling into the humid air, and turned her face away. Her hands had trembled when she tried to stand. Her skin was pale, slick with sweat, not from the storm, but from a fever that had been building in silence. For weeks, her body had borne the burden of obedience, silence, survival. Now it could bear no more. As the rain poured, she collapsed. The sound was soft, a thud against the wooden planks of the infirmary floor, the bowl tipping and spilling beside her. But what followed was not soft. The dog, who had been lying under her cot, leapt up and let out a noise so raw, so wounded, that it split the sound of the rain like a blade. It was not a bark, it was not a growl, it was a howl, low, mournful, rising with the wind like grief given voice. Guards nearby froze. One dropped his canteen. The infirmary flap burst open, 2 medics rushing in, their boots splashing through the muddy threshold. But before they could reach her, the dog moved. He planted himself over her fallen body, front paws braced, teeth bared, not in threat, but in warning. His eyes locked with theirs, wild and fierce, and for a moment no one dared come closer. The Texan with the creased hat was the first to speak. "Easy now, Chaplain. We're here to help her." His voice was calm, low, the way one speaks to a skittish horse. The dog didn't move. Rain dripped from his fur. His chest rose and fell in shallow, protective pants. The silence stretched, thick as the air. Then something shifted. One of the medics, a younger man with freckles and 2 clean boots, set his supplies down and crouched, palms up. He whispered, not to the nurse, but to the dog. "We're not going to hurt her," he said, as if truth could be spoken into fur. After a long pause, the dog stepped aside, slow and reluctant, but never breaking his gaze. The guards carried her gently, laying her on the cot, wiping her forehead with a cloth soaked in cool rainwater. The dog lay down again, pressing against the side of the bed, watching every motion with silent approval. He did not relax, not fully, but he allowed it. Outside the tent, the storm eased into a steady patter, and inside the camp, the murmurs began. They whispered not about medicine, but about mercy. In the weeks before, their world had been carved in hard lines: enemy, guard, prisoner, order. But now those lines were blurring. The dog had drawn a new boundary, not with wire or rifles, but with loyalty, and the men had honored it. The contradictions piled up like bowls in the mess hall. They were fed by their captors, treated by them, protected, even deferred to, because of a mutt that had chosen one of their own. It didn't make sense, but it was happening. And for the nurse, fevered and trembling, unconscious beneath a clean blanket, her breath shallow but steady, it changed something unseen. She didn't know she had been carried with care. She didn't know about the young medic's whisper, but she felt the heat of the dog against her side, and in the storm-scented dark, her body, long trained to brace, began instead to rest. No one spoke of courage that day. No one mentioned loyalty or surrender or honor. They just talked about the dog, about the howl, about how he wouldn't let her fall alone. The camp doctor never came that night. The storm had soaked the road leading from the outer quarters, turning the dirt to a kind of sucking clay, and the generator near the medical shed had sputtered out twice before surrendering to silence. In the absence of clean orders and proper tools, what filled the space instead was a man with dust on his boots and a hat creased from years of sun. He had been a ranch hand once, before uniforms claimed him, before Europe burned and the Pacific swallowed boys he had never known. Now he stood at the edge of the infirmary tent, staring down at the nurse whose breath fluttered like a wounded bird. He did not know her name. He had been told not to know her name. She was a prisoner, a defeated enemy, a line on a ledger. But he lowered himself anyway, knees creaking as they hit the wooden floor, and set aside his rifle as if it were nothing more than a tool he no longer needed. His movements were slow, uncertain, like a man touching something fragile for the first time. He placed a hand near her forehead, felt the heat. Not the dry heat of Texas sun, but the slick heat of illness. He swallowed. "All right now," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Easy." From a tin kettle set upon a small burner, he coaxed a simmering broth, the smell of chicken and salt curling through the damp air. It wasn't medical procedure. It was instinct, the kind he had learned when calves went down from infection, when storms came too quick, when life depended more on steady hands than manuals. He poured the liquid into a chipped cup, testing the warmth with his finger before holding it to her lips and lifting her head with care. She did not wake. He laid a blanket across her shoulders, tucking the corners like he'd once tucked bad-tempered colts during winter freezes. The gesture was gentle, but his face remained rigid, as if kindness had to be hidden behind discipline even when no one was watching, except the dog. Chaplain never took his eyes off him. He did not trust easily, not the way men did. He trusted through patterns, through tone, through whether someone approached with care or force. The guard felt that gaze against his back the entire time. So he spoke, softly, not for the woman, but for the animal. "Y'all got good instincts, old boy," he murmured while adjusting the blanket. "Better'n most men I know." The dog did not answer, but his ears shifted just slightly. Night crept heavier. The rain faded to a whisper, and in the silence came another sound, a cry. Somewhere down the row of bunks, another prisoner had awakened from a nightmare, her voice snapping through the air like a broken branch. A high, frightened shriek filled with old fear and newer dread. The guards stiffened instinctively. One reached toward his sidearm. Before anyone moved, Chaplain growled. The ranch hand saw it, and instead of shouting or kicking or forcing, he raised a hand at the guards. "Let her be," he said. "She ain't danger, just scared." The others hesitated. This hesitation was new. He had been taught that mercy weakened control, that hesitation endangered order, but he had just watched a dog command silence without barking, without force, without rank. He had watched it make soldiers pause, and he had listened. For years his world had been simple. There were sides, there were roles, there were commands. But now, kneeling beside a woman who had once worn a uniform stitched with his enemy's flag, he felt no thrill of victory, only the quiet pull of something more difficult, humanity. Word spread through the barracks by morning like smoke under doors. They heard how the cowboy, because that is what the women called him, not his rank, not his name, had stayed all night, how he had brewed broth like a kitchen hand, how he had whispered to the dog instead of shouting at the prisoner, how he had growled back at his own men to keep the peace around a Japanese nurse. The women started watching him when he passed. In their eyes, he was no longer just a guard. He had become something strange inside their world, a contradiction. A man who carried a rifle but laid it down when asked by a dog. A man who had obeyed not authority, but instinct. For the nurse, still suspended between sleep and waking, the storm became nothing more than a fading echo. She did not see the way he adjusted her blanket when she shivered. She did not hear his murmured stories about dust storms back home or a creek that ran dry every August. But she felt warmth, not just from the fever, from something else entirely. And the dog stayed pressed against her side, unmoving, as if guarding not just her body, but the fragile edge of a new truth forming around them all. The harmonica's song arrived like a memory no one realized they'd forgotten. It began low, almost by accident, as if the wind itself had learned a tune and decided to hum it across the dirt yard. The melody didn't belong to any anthem or military march. It wasn't patriotic or somber. It was soft, rambling, half lullaby, half prairie hymn. And it came from somewhere just beyond the barracks, beneath the gauze of sunset, where shadows of guards leaned against the fence and watched the sky turn gold. Chaplain lifted his head first, ears perked, body still. Then, slowly, as if drawn by an invisible string, the nurse's eyes opened. They were glassy, unfocused, but alive. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But her lips, dry and cracked, parted into something unmistakable. A smile. Music was not uncommon in the camp. The guards used it like wallpaper, playing records or letting someone strum a guitar during night shifts. It gave the illusion of normalcy, a soft veil draped over the barbed wire. For the Americans, it was a comfort. For the prisoners, it was confusing. A country that had dropped fire from the sky now sent vibrations through the walls that sounded like something you might hum to a child. The contradiction was disarming. But that night, the harmonica changed something. The man playing it, one of the older guards, whose boots had holes and whose knuckles were dark with sun, didn't seem to care who listened. He sat alone on an overturned crate, his back to the fence, breathing into the instrument with the patience of someone who knew the desert couldn't be rushed. His tune meandered through the camp like a wandering spirit, pausing outside bunks, dancing between tents, and settling at last beside a nurse and a dog. She was stronger now, not healed, but past the worst. Her fever had broken 2 days prior, her appetite returning in tiny, stubborn portions. Rice, broth, sips of tea. Her body, which had once seemed to recede from the world, was beginning to lean back toward it. Always beside her, the dog, and always near, if not close, watching from the perimeter, tending to small duties with deliberate steps, was the cowboy guard. He never called her by name, never asked for hers, but he brought clean cloths, refilled her water, set down a folded note once, unsigned, with only 3 words in scrawled print. "You're still here." She hadn't replied, but she'd pressed the paper flat and tucked it under her cot. The other women noticed the shift, too, the way the air had changed. The storm had broken more than clouds. It had broken the rhythm of captivity. No longer were they just numbers behind wire. They were part of something stranger, something harder to name. Compassion, perhaps, though that word still felt foreign on their tongues. That night, the nurse slept deeply, her breath even, her hands unclenched. Chaplain curled beside her, nose resting on the floorboards, his body finally relaxed. The cowboy passed, once before lights out, pausing by the infirmary, hat in hand. He didn't speak. He just stood there, letting the harmonica's last note hang in the air like a held breath. This was not softness. The war was still on. They were still prisoners. Guards still carried rifles. But the fence, though tall and coiled and crowned with metal, no longer defined everything. There was a kind of middle ground forming. Not freedom, not captivity, something else. The nurse, in her sleep, turned slightly toward the dog, and somewhere deep in the barracks a woman began to hum the tune the harmonica had played. It was not a song they had known before, but it felt like one they might carry. By the end of that week, the nurse could sit upright without wobbling. Her hair, once matted and damp with fever, had been brushed back into a soft knot by one of the older women. Her cheeks still bore the shadow of illness, but there was color now, faint and tender, like the first hint of dawn. She had not spoken much since the rain, but the silence no longer carried the weight of grief. It had shifted, somehow, into listening. And the dog, true to his silent ritual, remained by her side. Yet, as she grew stronger, his behavior began to change. Each morning she'd wake to find something placed beside her cot. The first was a smooth stick, weathered and pale, as though worn down by teeth or time. The next, a chicken bone, licked clean and dry. Then a shriveled sock, crusted with dirt and stiff with age. No one saw him deliver the gifts. They simply appeared, quiet offerings. The other women noticed. They began to brush the dog's fur with their fingers or scraps of cloth, gently removing thorns and burrs from his coat. They offered crusts of bread. One woman, who had once been a schoolteacher in Kyoto, whispered poems to him as if he might remember them for her. Another, who had lost 3 brothers to the war, tied a red thread around his collar, an old charm meant to guide souls safely home. Chaplain did not resist. He allowed the attention, moving from bunk to bunk, accepting touch with regal tolerance. But he always returned to the nurse before nightfall, settling beside her cot, resting his head near her folded blanket where the gifts were hidden. The cowboy, especially, seemed changed. He spoke less and did more, patching leaks in the infirmary roof, adjusting the lanterns so they didn't swing so harshly at night. When a new batch of prisoners arrived, wide-eyed, broken, barely standing, he walked them in slow, without yelling. And when one stumbled, he caught her by the arm, steadying her like he would a spooked mare. It wasn't softness. No one dared call it that. But something had shifted. The barbed wire still stood. The war still raged beyond the horizon. But inside the fence, within the fragile geometry of bunk beds and tin roofs, the shape of power was changing. All because of a dog who brought bones, and a woman who saved them. That night, as crickets stirred and the sky pulled its blanket of stars overhead, the nurse unwrapped her bundle and arranged the items beside her on the cot. The stick, the bone, the sock, a frayed button, even the red thread, now loose and faded. She looked at them not as objects but as echoes, proof of care, proof of presence. She placed her hand lightly on the dog's back and whispered again, not a word, but a sound, gentle, low, like the beginning of speech. The dog didn't lift his head, but his tail gave a single thump, as if to say, "I know." The news came quietly, almost like a mistake. No announcements, no horns, just a folded memo passed from barracks to mess hall to guard station, its words heavier than its paper. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The women, these tired, hollow-eyed prisoners who had learned to survive in stillness, would be going home. For a moment, No one believed it. Home had become a myth, a word without meaning. But then the cowboy himself came to the infirmary, eyes lowered, hat in hand, and said the words out loud. "Y'all are going back?" The nurse didn't speak. She just blinked, slow and uncertain, as if her mind couldn't catch up to the sound. Around her the others buzzed. Some whispered prayers, others fell to their knees. A few simply stared at their hands, trying to imagine them outside the wire. But the joy, when it came, was not clean. It was tangled, because joy has a twin, loss. And the question arrived almost immediately. What about the dog? No one had to ask it first. It just passed between them, a current of dread. Repatriation meant paperwork, quotas, ship manifests, medical clearances. It meant rules. And nowhere on those lists, nowhere in those columns, was there space for a stray hound who had wandered into their hearts without permission. Chaplain, oblivious to borders and bureaucracy, kept to his routine. He brought the nurse a stone that morning, smooth and gray, with a chip at the edge, and lay beside her blanket, panting softly in the shade. But the women had already begun. They approached the guards, hesitant at first, then with purpose. Their English was broken, their tone respectful, but the meaning was clear. He comes with us. One woman, who had once barely lifted her head, now stood at the mess gate holding a hand-drawn petition. "Please," she said, "he help us. We not forget." Some of the guards laughed, others scoffed, but one, young, freckles under his helmet, took the paper without a word. The cowboy didn't laugh. He stood at the edge of the group, arms folded, watching the scene unfold. That night he walked the perimeter once, then made his way to the infirmary. The nurse was awake. So was the dog. He knelt beside her cot. "They ain't gonna let him go," he said simply, voice like gravel soaked in regret. "Rules say no animals on them ships. Quarantine, disease, all that." She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She only reached down, touched the dog's ear, and gave the smallest nod. It wasn't defeat. It was understanding. The cowboy swallowed hard. "But I got a place. Ranch out near Fredericksburg. Got chickens, fence, a porch he can sleep under. If he stays, he ain't gonna be alone." Still, she didn't speak, but her fingers moved, slow, deliberate, and unwrapped the edge of her blanket. She took the stick, the bone, and the stone, and placed them one by one in the cowboy's hand. He looked at her, eyes red. "I'll tell him you said goodbye," she smiled then. Not wide, not loud, just enough. The dog's tail tapped once against the floor. The next morning, as the women lined up for transport, the dog did not come. He had been taken early, gently, with jerky in one hand and a rope looped loose in the other. The cowboy didn't look back, and as the trucks rumbled toward the horizon, the nurse sat tall. In her lap, the old sock, washed, folded, was the only thing she took with her. If you've been moved by this story so far, like this video and comment below, telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. The sun hadn't yet broken over the horizon when the guards gave the call. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of packed earth and burnt coffee. Rows of women stood by the gate, their eyes forward, their shoulders squared in silence. Some clutched meager belongings, rolled blankets, worn shoes, a photo or two folded tight against their chests. But no one cried. Not yet. The nurse stood among them, thinner than when she'd arrived, stronger too. The fever was gone. Her silence had become something the others respected, not absence, but presence without waste. Her hands were still, her blanket folded, but something flickered behind her eyes, as if the morning itself pressed too hard against her chest. Then, from the far side of the yard, a shape moved. Not fast, not loud, just a shadow at first, slipping through the gap behind the water barrels. Chaplain. His tail was low, but not tucked. His ears twitched with each crunch of boots, each rustle of uniform, and when he reached the gate, he stopped. He didn't bark, he didn't whine, he just stood there, watching. The guards exchanged glances but said nothing. The nurse turned. Their eyes met, hers and the dog's. 1,000 miles of war, of pain, of language and belief. None of it stood between them now. He had followed her through sickness, sat beside her in silence, offered her scraps as if they were relics. And now he stood still, not coming closer, not asking for anything more, only watching. The truck engine coughed to life. The line began to move, slow and mechanical, one foot, then another. The nurse climbed the wooden step into the back of the transport. No one spoke. The cowboy stood at the far end of the fence, hands in his pockets, gaze low. Even he seemed unsure now, of rules, of right, of what farewell meant. And then, just as the truck rolled forward and the gates creaked open, the dog ran. Not toward the guard station, not toward safety, toward the road. Chaplain's legs stretched long, pads hitting gravel with the wild grace of something free. He didn't bark, he didn't yelp. He just ran, chasing the truck as if the earth itself had told him to follow. Dust kicked up in clouds. The truck rattled and groaned, and still he chased. 100 yards, then 2. Women turned to look. One covered her mouth. The nurse gripped the wooden rail of the truck bed, leaning out, her face unmoving, but her eyes burned. Chaplain stumbled once, his front paw dragging slightly, but he kept going. His ribs showed with each breath. His mouth hung open, tongue lolling. He was old now. The run cost him, and then it happened. The nurse reached into her arms and pulled free the blanket, the one that had held the bone, the sock, the stone, the red thread. She leaned out over the edge and with a flick of her wrist let it go. It sailed like a flag in the wind, caught the morning light, and landed in the dirt just ahead of the dog. Chaplain skidded to a halt. He sniffed it once, then lowered himself onto it, slow, deliberate, curling his body tight into the center. Dust rose around him in a soft cloud, but he did not move again. The truck did not stop. The women watched until the road curved and the fence disappeared behind trees and thyme. Some closed their eyes. Others did not blink, afraid they'd lose what they'd just seen. The nurse sat back, hands empty now, her lap bare. But on her face there was peace. Not the peace of endings, but of something honored, of a promise kept. Years later, in a narrow room tucked between a tailor's shop and a stairwell smelling of steamed rice and old wood, an elderly woman sat by a low table and opened a rusted tin box. The hinges squealed softly, like something half-forgotten, protesting to be heard. Her hands, calloused and thin from decades of work, did not shake. They had learned steadiness long ago, not from peace, but from necessity. Inside the box were not medals, not honors, not even letters, only fragments, a faded train ticket, a button from a uniform long burned, and at the bottom a photograph. It was small and creased, its edges eaten away by time. Yet the image remained. A young woman's silhouette was visible at the edge of a cot, and beside it, curled on the wooden floor, lay a dusty hound, his ribs visible, his ears half-pricked, his eyes closed, as if dreaming. The old woman exhaled when she saw him. She had not seen him in decades, not since the gates of that camp closed behind her, and the American road bent away like a thought unfinished. not since dust swallowed his form on that final morning. And yet he had never left her. Tokyo had not welcomed her return. There had been no parade, no banners, only silence and suspicion, followed by the grinding rhythm of survival. In the first years after the war, she had lived in a single room with 3 other women, working long shifts, folding hospital linens, never once telling her story. Even among the broken, there was hierarchy. Those who returned from prisoner camps were not considered survivors. They were considered questions. How had they lived when others had died? Had they bowed too easily? Had they become too soft? She had learned to answer none of it. Instead, she worked, she stitched, she healed. She became a nurse again, not for soldiers, not for a flag, but for children born into the rubble, for widows with no names left to say, for old men haunted by smoke. She wrapped wounds, she washed blood. And in quiet moments, when the hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and boiled rice, she remembered the scent of dust and wet fur. The dog had become her silent benchmark. Not for loyalty, not even for love, but for meaning. As the years passed, his presence shaped her more than she ever admitted. When patients yelled in pain, she sat beside them like he had sat beside her. When children came in crying, she placed a warm cloth across their foreheads the same way the cowboy had. She never spoke of the American Guard, never spoke of the camp kitchens or the harmonica. But in small, unnoticed gestures, she carried them all forward, and always she carried him. The old sock lay folded beside the tin box, still intact after all those years, softened into cloth like memory itself. She never cleaned it any more. It no longer needed cleansing. It had matured into relic. Outside the window, Tokyo moved forward, trams groaning along rails, new buildings rising where ash once ruled. People hurried past, young faces unaware that another world had ever existed. But inside that small room, a bridge remained between a dusty camp, a wooden cot, a final morning, between a woman who had been trained to die and a dog who had chosen that she live. She traced her fingers over the photograph one last time, her touch barely grazing the faded contours of his fur. There was no sorrow in her eyes now, only comprehension, the kind that comes when stories after years of silence finally rest, because captivity had taken her name, but his loyalty had returned her soul. If this story touched you, please like the video and leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? Let us know.